Hey everyone, Clio here, and today we are going through my February wrap-up. So in 2022 so far I've never filmed a mid-month wrap-up, and I don't think that that's gonna change for the remainder of the year, but we'll see. But so I have a full month to go through. I don't have too many books individually, so hopefully I can still kind of keep it short. But so, as always, there will be 3 numbers on the screen. First one will be the TBR, which was at 31 at the beginning of this month. 32? Wait. 32. So my TBR was at TBR at the beginning of this month. My book buying credit system was at 3. And then the amount of books that I read, that number will be back at 0 because that will be climbing throughout this video. Now, starting in order of when I read these, I first read The Corrections by Jonathan Franzen. So I read this one on holiday the first week of February. I was on holiday in Gran Canaria, and I read this one on holiday, and I must say that I was pleasantly surprised by this one because I had kind of expected to struggle with this one because this is an over 600-page general fiction book all about this sort of like Midwestern American family and their sort of like dysfunctional family dynamics, I guess. And so I was expecting that to be kind of a slog at times, but it absolutely was not. And I'm not necessarily going to say that the story in this was super interesting or anything like that, but it was just such compelling writing, such fluid writing, because I flew through this one. I basically finished this almost in like 2 days, or the majority of this was read in 2 days in any case, because I was just not feeling like putting it down. I am not somebody who is able to like marathon read. I cannot read for a very long period at a time because usually I kind of get tired of reading and I need multiple breaks. But with this one I could really like listen to it. In this case I was listening to the audiobook, and I could listen to it non-stop almost without needing any types of breaks. And so I really enjoyed this one a whole lot. Does this mean that I'm gonna dive into more of Jonathan Franzen's work? I don't necessarily know, because it's also not like I got so much out of this or like this is a new favorite. I just really liked the writing itself, but I didn't necessarily care all that much about the story. So I really did enjoy it, but it's not necessarily something I would recommend based on the fact that I didn't necessarily care for that story myself. But if somebody were to be looking for this type of book, then I can absolutely say that this is a great one to read because of that writing style that also really works very well. Next up, I read The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. So this is an epic high fantasy series. It is a trilogy. All books in the trilogy are out, so it's safe to start in case you don't want to start ongoing series. So in this one, we are basically starting off the story with these 3 friends who are at this sort of like, let's call it an academy, a magic school or something like that. And they basically have to go through this sort of like final trial. And if you fail the trial, basically a sort of like ring is put on you that prevents you from using magic from that point onward. Because in the history of this world, something has happened, some sort of an abuse of magical power has happened, and as a result, magic is bound to these sort of like strict rules. And when I say it's bound, it really is bound. These magicians cannot physically do harm to normal people, for example. They are really prevented from doing that. However, one of this group of 3 really struggles with his magical power, and so he's very much fearing that he will not succeed and that he will become a shadow the next day. However, things take a turn in the middle of the night as he's approached by one of these people who administer the test, and he is basically sent off on a mission. He and one of his friends together go on that mission, and their other friend is left to wake up to a massacre. I really enjoyed this one because I think it had a really interesting world building. It had a lot of history and a lot of hidden history, basically. We are not spoon-fed much information, so we kind of have to figure out more of what has taken place in the past throughout this book. We also learn a whole lot more about the magic system, and there actually are also 2 magic systems within this world, and I thought that they were also very interesting magic systems to dive into. And yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I think it definitely has a little bit of a lull at some point. There definitely was towards the end. I had this kind of feeling of, okay, I'm done with it, I'm ready to move on, and there was still like 100 pages to go. So I kind of feel like maybe I just wasn't there for the full intense action sequence that was taking place at that point in time, or it had just taken a little bit too long to build up to that. that. And so I was kind of getting tired of the book at that point in time. So it definitely had a little bit of a lull period for me, but I'm more than intrigued about what is coming next, and I really think it was an interesting world. And so in terms of the world, it kind of felt like it was a traditional setting fantasy, but it was doing so many things that didn't feel... Are you okay? Cat almost fell off the sofa. But it was doing a whole lot of things that didn't feel like traditional fantasy. So I'm definitely interested in continuing on with the series. Probably once I reach 0 TBR, I'll immediately buy the sequel to this book and dive further into this series at that point in time. Next up, I continued with the Greenbone Saga by reading Jade War by Fonda Lee. So this is book 2 in the Greenbone Saga, in which we are basically looking at this clan who is involved in the jade trade on the fictional island of Kekon. Now this is very much sort of like mafia type fantasy. It's set in our modern world, or like in a modern world that's like, I don't know, that's maybe like 30 years in the past or something like that. It is Asian inspired fantasy, and so as I said, it deals with a lot of clan politics, so it's very much also a political fantasy. And in this political fantasy, aside from the politics itself, it also very much looks at the economical aspect, which is something that I don't see all that often. It's definitely also there in the Empire trilogy by Jenny Woods and Raymond E. Feist, but I don't typically see so much emphasis being put on it in political fantasy, whereas it's a very interesting aspect to political fantasy, of course. For political power to be gained, you need economical power, so I very much appreciate that side to it. I will say that with the first one, I definitely struggled to some extent. I think without the audiobook, I would have definitely struggled with that one a whole lot more. The audiobook definitely saw me through for that, and I felt like I wasn't getting enough of the ruthlessness that I want from this book. When I hear mafia type fantasy, and this definitely has the setup of a mafia type story, I expect there to be ruthless, cutthroat strategy all the way. And that was not the case. And so with Jade War, I definitely feel like there is more of those cases, more of those instances in which I'm kind of shocked with where people are taking things. And I'm just hoping that that means that I'm going to get a really nice conclusion in Jade Legacy, because I still feel like it isn't dark enough. And I guess the reason for that is that I feel like we are looking at characters from one side of the conflict only, and things would be a little bit more ruthless towards the reader if we were looking at two sides of the conflict, and there isn't enough conflict on the one side for my personal taste. But I am definitely still enjoying this a whole lot. It's just not one that I've like fallen in love with or anything like that yet. So there definitely were a lot of moments in this one in which I did feel like that, in which I was like, oh, this is exactly what I wanted from this series, but not enough. Next up, I tried reading The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens, but I just think that I'm done with Charles Dickens, or at least for like a decade or so. This is probably like my 8th or 9th Dickens. The one before this I DNF'd as well. The one before that I thought I was like meh. The one before that I didn't like as much as I thought I was gonna like. So I'm on a little bit of a bad streak here with Charles Dickens, and so I think it's better for me to just quit. I don't know whether I just liked different things when I was reading it at the time, whether if I reread those books now I wouldn't like them now neither, or whether it's just a case of at this point in time, you know, it all just feels repetitive. I just feel like, what's the point? It's just gonna be the same as all of his other books have been. And that's not necessarily the case, of course, but I then also don't feel like I can push through his book because I'm kind of just like zoning out while I'm reading. And so this definitely was happening with this one. Of course, it didn't help that I was trying with the audiobook, so at some point I did try to physically read it as well, but I just found myself not having enough of an interest to put in that minimal effort, so clearly indicating that I'm just really not interested at this point in time in reading any more Dickens. So I think I'm gonna take a very long sabbatical from Dickens, if not a permanent break, but I will say if you're looking for a Dickens, I would definitely recommend some of his shorter works. So definitely A Christmas Carol, one of my favorites, but then you could maybe perhaps go into something like Great Expectations, for example, or Oliver Twist, even though Oliver Twist is probably already a little bit on the longer side. But those are some of the first books by him that I read that I really enjoyed, and so I'm starting to think that it's just because I read them first that I enjoyed them so much. And then we ended the month by reading The Name of All Things by Jen Lyon's second book in A Course of Dragons. This is a reread for me, and I annotated this time around because the first time I didn't have physical copies yet. These annotations, this is why I don't annotate books, because I just annotate everything when I annotate. So in The Name of All Things we are basically starting the story kind of afresh, because the main bulk of the story that is being told takes place at the same time as the story that was told in the first novel. Now, A Course of Dragons is a really difficult series to give a synopsis for, because a lot of the main plot line is something that you discover throughout. But basically we start off the series with Kieran, who is this young boy growing up on the streets. He is basically sort of like a thief, and one day as he's burgling this house, he stumbles upon a scene that he should not have witnessed. On top of that, the very next day he stumbles upon a demon upon the streets, a demon who seems to think that he is linked to some sort of a prophecy. Now, prophecy is basically the binding material between books 1 and 2, because the character that we are following in book 2 also has a prophecy linked to her. Now, in this one we are once again using this structure of multiple layers of narration. We have the entire book is basically a report being presented to, in this case, Lord Farr. And the report consists of a conversation that takes place between Janelle, who we are briefly introduced to within the first book, Brother Cone, who I think is a new character to us, and another character. And in that conversation, Janelle and Brother Cone will take turns telling the story of what has happened to them leading up to that point in time. And once again, at some point in time, the narration catches up to the present day and the story continues from there. With this one, the main thing that I really like about it is the world building, is the culture that is introduced within this one. Because in this one a whole lot of conversation goes into gender roles. In the Jortese culture that Janelle belongs to, there are different gender terms than the ones that we are familiar with. So Jortese culture is very much a horse-centered culture, and so their gender terms are also referring to horses. So they have gelding, stallion, and mare. Basically, stallion is a sort of like stereotypical masculine gender pattern. This sort of like protector, the alpha, the strong dominant ruler type character. Whereas a mare, for example, is a subservient caring character. For example, it can be a serving lady, it can be a farmer, for example. Those are all mares. And your sex at birth does not determine which gender role you have. There's also a gelding, but I'm not entirely sure anymore what that is, because it's basically not really talked about a lot within this book. Most of the talk is about the stallion versus mare role. And Janelle being born female but identifying as a stallion is very much something that will open up this debate, especially as within the storyline a lot of conversation also goes into the intermingling of cultures. Basically, there are some outsiders trying to infiltrate Jortese society. However, their misconceptions about Jortese cultures are blatantly obvious based on conversations involving such terminology as stallion and mare. Definitely enjoyed my reread of this one, but it definitely still remains my least favorite book within the series as a whole. But things are looking up, because in March we are going into The Memory of Souls, which then becomes my favorite book of the series so far. And so there you have it. Those are all the books that I read in February. I finished my TBR 4 days early, probably because I DNF'd the old Curiosity shop. But yeah, overall a good reading month, I would say. I made a little bit better progress when it comes to my Zero TBR project, so I reduced it by 4 physical books this time around, and so we're ending the month on a physical TBR of 28 books. This is still not the pace I need to be going at, but that's just if you look at books, not if you look at page count. Because in terms of page count, I think I'm pretty much in line with what I need to be doing. I have just over 10,000 pages to go over the next 4 months, and that is pretty doable. So hopefully that means I can finish before the month of July starts. But so, 28 books left on my TBR. In the month of March, I'm hoping to reduce it by a further 5 physical books, and I'm hoping to have finished all of my over 500 page books at that point in time. So yeah, nothing remains except for me to round off this video. In case you've read any of these books, feel free to leave your thoughts on them in the comments down below. And as always, I hope you enjoyed this video and see you guys for the next one. Bye!